So I was thinking about this, this lecture today, and I thought, I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone if I would say that there are bad outcomes of AI utilization. I think a lot of you will be interested in the theme, and so you're very open to that message. So I thought about something that I find more surprising, perhaps, and that is the question of, despite of all the stories that we're already hearing about what AI can do, it can be racist, it can have blind spots, despite of all those stories of other social scientists or of other AI experts, why do we keep believing in the hype of AI? And why do we keep using it? And this is involving us as well, right? I mean, I think a lot of us will be worried when we think about AI in the future, or slightly concerned, and yet I think it's safe to say that a lot of us will have used it even today, right? So this is what fascinates me, and I hope to kind of get to that question also. I have a couple of themes that I wanted to touch on. I'm gonna talk today not so much on the parts where Daniel will speak of. I hope he's going to speak about politics and about corporate interest and all these things, and we'll have the discussion afterwards. But I want to talk about 4 themes that keep coming up in my own research. The first might be human creativity. So if you ask me what is your first answer to this despite question, I would say it's because of the human tendency to work really creatively with technology. The second answer would be pizza, obviously. And then the third answer has to do with another human tendency, namely the tendency to ask completely wrong or at least really bad questions. And then finally, I would like to talk a little bit about magic, because I do think magic is involved here as well. Just as a really quick background, I'm a futures anthropologist, which I think is always a very kind of trendy term for saying that I'm really interested in transformations. I've studied how climate changes impact on people who are really daily bothered by it, for example. And I've worked in conflict settings to see how humanitarian aid is now mainly influenced by new technology. Think drones for triage, for selecting who gets aid and not. And now in this current research project, or in one of my bigger research projects, I focus together with a team how doctors and nurses are increasingly using AI to make decisions with it. And we look all very groomed in this picture, but most of the team members are on field work. One is in China at the moment, the other one is in Denmark, so they can't really be there. We're so interested in this theme because human care seems to be such a human thing, right? I mean, if you think about how a nurse acts, then of course they might be using numbers and statistics, but we all, I think, have stories about that one time when a general practitioner really listened to you, or that one time when a nurse really sensed something. And it's interesting, but also hard to imagine how that could be completely automated. In this research project, I think a lot of people, and this might be interesting or relevant to say, a lot of people, their minds go instantly to the black boxes, right? We think, oh, it's going to be this very complicated algorithm, and that might be dangerous if they would be using that. My interest lies with the preferably simple algorithms. So it's basically a digital policy. It's an automated system that says, if this, then this. Or it's a system that helps doctors paint the organs in a body in 3D, something that used to cost them 4 hours if you would do it manually, and now this thing does it in 10 minutes. And those are examples of pretty benign AI uses, or so it seems. And yet, we find that even the very simple algorithms do influence the way in which people make decisions. And I'm going to give you a couple of concrete examples, also constantly referring back to the despite why question, because if this is already happening, then why do we keep using it so collectively? But just to give you a general idea, there seems to be, and I think we all recognize this, an aureole of objectivity around technology, right? I don't think many of us will double check what Google or ChatGPT gives us, or double check what your calculator says. It's kind of a trust thing. We don't really know, but it seems really wise. There's something there. There's also the very well-known, unfortunately, for the Dutch people who followed the whole situation with the Belastingdienst, with the tax company over the past years. There's this, where's there smoke, there should be fire idea, right? Which also helps. If the computer flags something, if the computer gives an alarm, then a nurse or a doctor might be more intrigued, might be more interested in whether there is indeed something off. So all of these things make an impact. And then there's one more thing, namely, it doesn't have to be a black box to be pretty complicated for a lot of people. The people that I work with, and we work in 8 hospitals around the world, they're really highly educated, just like I'm guessing, just by context, most of you. They're very smart, but they're not coders, and they're not developers. And in order to understand what an algorithm does, you need a kind of abstract thinking. It's not my biggest force, but for me, it's also not my main responsibility. It becomes the main responsibility of a nurse if she gets to be, or he gets to be assumed to be the human evaluator of this AI. And this is what is now happening in regulations and in ethical AI frameworks. These people are supposed to be the persons that stop the AI when necessary. So they get an outcome, and nobody wants AI to be automated, right? You don't want to have an AI that completely works by itself, not with patients. We're all very wary of that. So the alternative is to speak of a human in the loop. There needs to be a human who then evaluates whether this AI thing is saying something that makes sense or not, which demands a human skill, a human eye, a lot of human practice. But I hope to show you that a lot of these people, they don't really know what they have to evaluate. Not because they're stupid, but because they're completely overburdened with another digital literacy training. So you should imagine nowadays, if I walk into a hospital and I'll talk to management, some of them have forbidden technology companies to come into the hospital and pitch their tools, because they come with so many that people get really tired of them. But it's also really attractive, right? If you're a doctor and you have long waiting lists and you're very frustrated, and an AI technology company comes at you and says, we can pay for the technology if you please want to check it, and then we can do some academic publications. You can have some PhD people here working for you. So it's not for bad motivations that some of these doctors says, yes, please, I really need that. But what you get is a multitasking nurse or doctor, one that is in their lunch break, trying to follow another course to stay updated with the new technology that was introduced, while also eating a sandwich and texting their husband that they need to pick up the kid, right? For everybody, that sounds familiar, most likely, for how your lunch break is. Some people speak, some of my interlocutors speak of a facade of safety, which I think is a very apt wording for this situation. It gives the outside world the idea that, yes, there are human evaluators, but for them, very often, it's not entirely clear. But yeah, they followed the training. Then who remains responsible, right? I've been trying to seek for the answer. I'm not sure if I'm entirely correct yet. I wrote a couple of articles with humongously long sentences and titles, I now see. I don't know what got to me. And then I was probably tired by the submission system that takes so long. And then I co-authored a theater play about it, where it's my interlocutors who explain their fears of being held responsible for something that they fear is not clear enough for them. They're not entirely sure. And don't be mistaken, also on those work floors, a lot of people find this very scary to say, because you don't want to be the old-fashioned guy. You don't want to be the stupid guy who doesn't understand. And so there is a social pressure for kind of acting as if you understand. There are a couple of themes that I feel convinced matter as well if we talk about the despite question. One is the wins and risks of human creativity. So what I see a lot in our study is that caretakers will bend over backwards to give good care to their patients despite of new technology or in a different modus but with technology. So they will get an AI tool that they will have to use, and sometimes they find it rather helpful, but they also have coping ways around it. So they might do extra check-ins with their patients, for example, because they're not completely certain that the patient understood it. They might fill in the automated form, but then also keep handwritten notes. In recent fieldwork in the United Arab Emirates, one of the PhD students came back with a beautiful finding saying, hey, the nurses sit really closely to the patients so that despite of all the AI saying nothing is off, they can still hear the breathing of their patients really well, so they can still intervene if necessary. You see a lot of extra physical work is put in to work with AI, but then also work around AI. Which is beautiful, I think, because it really shows that these people, it matters to them. But it also gives us a very unrealistic idea of whether AI is indeed as cost and time efficient as we are always promised, right? Because these people don't collectively protest against AI. They have their individual ways around it. Very pragmatic, very creative, very on the spot, not necessarily good towards management who keep then investing in AI. And they're not just creative, I would say, in deeds, they're also creative in words. So all of my research is always co-creative, which means that, you know, I make a theater play with these people, or we speak together at events. So I accompany my doctors and my nurses to go to a conference, for example, and then we'll have a double lecture. And what happened there, and this really took me a year or so to understand or to make sense of for myself, is when in the backstage, behind closed doors, during all of our interviews, when we would speak to nurses, they would always emphasize the way in which they use intuition. And this is a very well-known fact. If you read nursing articles, if you read nursing studies, it will be very clear that human intuition, even if we don't know how it necessarily works, it works, right? And all of them will be able to tell you stories of how they use it on a daily basis, just to kind of sense like something is off with that patient. She looks a little bit pale. I just want to go back and double check. But as soon as we went on stage together in a more public setting, they would completely change that narrative. They would wave it off, even if I would say it, kind of thinking, you know, I'll tell the beautiful story you told me, and they would be like, no, that's not really important, or we used to do it like that, but nowadays it's different. And they would reframe the narrative towards evidence-based types of working. They would start talking about numbers and statistics and rubrics that they use. And of course, these are really important too. I see that during their workdays. But so is the intuition. And suddenly, that was taken towards the backside. And then after such a conference, they would say, sorry, you know, we didn't want to kind of raise too much attention for that. So you weren't wrong, but we have to be careful with kind of spreading that message about how we use intuition. Because in the public setting, I think we can all empathize with this. We live in a world in which we're very addicted to proving things and for evidence and for showing how you got to something. And we don't really know how you feel something in your gut. And yet, literature says that the best expert nurses are the ones with the most embodied experience and are the ones who can often not describe why they came to save such and such patients. So what is happening then is that in order to justify their ways of working towards an audience where they fear seems to be suspicion of authorities, a lot of knowledge about healthcare from ChatGPT. They kind of have to prove their really good performance, their expertise, and they do so with numbers, which is really understandable. But again, this creative practice, albeit in narratives, I think makes it much easier to automate or to replace these people. Because if you basically say, we work on numbers, then it's very easy to say for a manager, we have an AI that can work on numbers too. And that one is probably quicker. So another theme that kept coming up has to do with the human tendency, not just to be creative, but also to ask really stupid questions. And I think we all do that if we don't watch out. I think without exception, when I'm on a conference nowadays to talk about ethical AI, I'm always being asked the same question, namely, what type of technology do we need to overcome the expected or anticipated health crisis? Which, I mean, if you lean into that question, it's a really relevant question. So I always try to answer it very seriously. And I will tell you, I will give you some positive examples from my fieldwork, which are there. Perhaps we can talk about those after the lectures to not make us all depressed. I'll give some positive examples. I'll talk a bit about ethical AI issues. But of course, this all distracts from another question, which may be much more important and much shorter also. Not what type of technology do we need for better care, but what do we need for better care? And I think if you would ask that question, my answer would be very brief and urgent. It's namely time. All of my interlocutors will tell you that in order to give good care, in order to reflect, in order to understand the AI that they've been using, in order to understand what exactly they need to evaluate, in order to do yet another literacy training in digital tools, they need more time. Time to sit with a patient, time to kind of ask a question during one of those courses. And I think you and I will probably recognize this, assuming that most of us work here or are students here. I don't think for good scholarship we need yet another rubric or more technology. But a lot of us would say, oh, I would just love a week of reading, you know, to really reflect on what I've been doing. And it's the same there. And this is not just for good care, it's also for satisfaction of your job. At this moment, when we're talking about the anticipated health crisis, I never hear about the huge staff over that is now occurring with nurses. A lot of them take different jobs. They have them reschooled. And why? Because they don't like their jobs, because they have to work with such high numbers. And so that's not very helpful. But perhaps if they would have more time, they might feel it's actually their job. Also, don't forget the problem that a lot of the managers I speak to, a lot of the hospital boards, with very well intentions, and we'll talk about those because I think the intentions cling to an idea of hope or perhaps desperateness about perhaps AI is the thing that can help solve this problem. But with those intentions and with that hope, oftentimes you see that the idea that AI will make things more time efficient is only partly right. Because what happens as well is this very odd logic, namely, after AI has been installed and introduced and everybody's had their class, the expectation is that nurses can have more patients now, and doctors can see more patients, because now there's AI to help, right? So I wrote a blog about this. I'm very happy to send that over. I also wanted to talk about pizza in relation to this. I'm not sure if any of you saw this. It was very big in all the bushaltes and all the bus stops. It's called a bitterballen pizza. It's new, you can buy it. And I thought it was such a good example that I just had to stop and make a photo of it because it's probably nice, right? Like most people like pizza. A lot of people, especially Dutch people, like bitterballen. But is it really necessary to put them on top of each other? And does it outweigh the potential downsides? I mean, probably a lot of calories involved, a lot of dairy, a lot of meat on top of each other. We can all think of the ethical issues, right? And I often, when I'm on these conferences and I'm being asked again that wrong question, or just the question that is basically distracting us, I think about this pizza nowadays. It's like, well, it's nice as an extra tool, but was it really necessary? And do we have an understanding of the costs that we're making, or of the coping strategies that people have to make? In a book on AI politics called An Artificial Revolution, Ivana Bartoletti talks about a man that comes to her talk. And she is explaining that he's really concerned. And this guy, he's talking about the future of AI, about the AI ethics, and she says, well, you know, he's not wrong. I have his worries as well, but he's so distracted, right? Because aren't we ignorant if we're not asking the exact key questions? Namely, who's introducing this AI? What is it for? What's the lucrative agenda? Who's making it? For what? Finally, I would love to talk about magic, which is a thing that I'm playing with recently, also in a special issue that I'm creating around it. Now, of course, my interlocutors are far from naive, right? They know exactly what works per AI. They also know what doesn't work. And yet there seems to be a very interesting gap between their current underwhelming experiences. Sometimes they're positive, but a lot of them are actually very underwhelmed. And the consistent, very stubborn idea that in the future, AI will be inevitable. It will be everywhere. And I'm not the first to say that because of that collective idea, we keep investing in it. And I would say that part of the reason why individuals choose to go for individual coping strategies rather than for collective protest also has to do with this idea that AI is inevitable. You can't really stop it, so you better have to learn and work with it, right? Magic, if you look at magic from an anthropological lens, you can see that anthropologists often said that magic works, at least for a major part, because people believe it will work. It's like if you believe that something will get better, there's a fair chance that it actually will, right? You see this in healthcare, you see it in all types of things. And in one of the cases, it was an interesting fact that this hospital had an AI that needed a lot of supervision. It needed a lot of evaluation. So the doctors working with this AI needed to be really well trained. And all of the doctors were very proud. They told us, like, oh, I have thousands of hours of training, so I can see from the side of my eye that something is off with the AI. But within the same interview, they would say, but the newcomers won't get this training anymore. They won't do the training that we had. And the reason was that AI had made it so simple to do a certain task quicker that nobody thought it was morally just to wait longer than that. They thought if you can do it fast, you kind of have to do it fast. Otherwise, the patients are waiting. And if you look in that hospital, if you walk around there, you'll see, you'll see patients who really deserve the attention. So again, it's from a really good heart. It's from wanting to give the good care. But this AI was making mistakes already. And yet they were very normalized almost towards the idea that they had to go towards that risk, because it was now possible. And so who can stop that possibility? So collective belief or magic is a thing, I would like to argue, that does things. It's something that holds force, that holds power. If we move into the direction of it's inevitable, then indeed, it's going to be inevitable, right? And with that, my dear Daniel, I'd like to manifest you on stage. I had one question prepared for you to ponder on, which we discussed beforehand, so you don't have to act surprised. The thing is that I've mainly focused on how overhyped AI is in the realm of healthcare. And you asked me to pose one question, so it would be more natural for you to come on stage. Do you recognize this whole magical idea of this hype dynamic in Brussels and The Hague? That's my question to you. There you go.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks to you. Thanks especially to you, Roanne. That was super amazing. To start answering that question, I want to take you to the Hotel Sofitel in Brussels. That's that little thing down there, a screenshot from Google Maps here. And as you can see, that's pretty close, just walking distance. Here's the European Parliament, and up here is the Berlaymont building, which is the main seat of the European Commission. And the date we're going to is the 3rd of October, 2024, and I was there with my colleague and friend Matti Ylönen from the University of Helsinki, and there was Politico's Tech Summit held at that 5-star hotel, and we somehow got in. And normally tickets are super expensive, but because everybody realized that we were poor academics, we got in anyway. So there we were. The first thing we checked into was the Booking.com photo booth. We're already having a good laugh there. As you can see, you're sort of like ushered into that booth. You take a picture with the full palms in the background, and you get these sorts of things, having a good laugh there. And from there, all of a sudden, we moved on to the Microsoft stand, and we found this little booklet right here, which brought us from the slightly ridiculous to the seriously concerning, because Microsoft was here announcing its ideas for Europe in the next 5 years, because it, of course, knows best for all of us how Europe could be democratic, dynamic, and digital. Not only that, right next to that, there was also a report that's this thing right here about AI in Europe meeting the opportunity across the EU. We were so flabbergasted that both of us actually had another big laugh, asked the people who were manning this stand whether they could actually take a photo of us, and we would sort of like pose with these things as if we were sort of like Microsoft consultants, so that we would have this for posterity. Now on we went to the other side of this, and there was Google's stand, and it had this thing right here, and that's when I really started wondering for good. They were handing out this report right here, the economic opportunity of AI in the EU, beyond the hype, boosting EU competitiveness with generative AI. And so it had these little 2 infographics. The whole thing was maybe like this big. And I want to give these a closer look. So the first thing here, this is zooming in, was about AI can help solve key societal challenges in the EU. Roanne, you've already talked about this a little bit. So down here, for example, this was something that Google had commissioned. It promised us that 40% of staff shortages in healthcare in Europe can be alleviated by generative AI. Now, isn't that great? And over here, also for the public sector, AI is fantastic news, Google told us. And it would free up resources to alleviate bottlenecks, improve service quality, like the whole shebang. 250 billion would be saved if we just please brought Google AI to the public services, right? This is the report right here, and from there, the key figure that came out of that, and this is of course the sort of stuff that in Brussels really catches people's attention. Here it said that in the peak year, generative AI alone could boost the EU's prosperity by 1.2 to 1.4 trillion euros, and that would be an increase of 8% of GDP in 10 years if, only if, the EU achieves widespread adoption of generative AI. Now, just about the same time, this report had come out in Brussels. This is the Draghi report, which has since then become sort of like the go-to document for Brussels policymakers when it comes to making sense of the situation that Europe finds itself in and the problems that it has. And the Draghi report has diagnosed a European competitiveness crisis. The overall diagnosis is that Europe falls behind its main 2 economic competitors, the United States and China. And the way that Ursula von der Leyen basically summarized this whole thing was that the root cause of Europe's problem is a lack of innovation, and nowhere is that more clear and more pronounced than in AI. So that, for me, is the starting point, the thing that I want to put under the magnifying glass here. So the overall master frame that I'm talking about at this event, but also when I visit people in Brussels, talk to policymakers, parliamentarians, and these sorts of people, is a very economistic way of thinking about what AI is, what AI does, and why AI holds the key to a more prosperous future for Europe. It's a very economistic way of thinking about it that is summarized in the kinds of graphs and lines and figures and statistics that I just showed you. Now that's it from me with slides for now, because most of the rest is about the narrative constructs that get bandied about there. So what you come across then is a narrative that Europe needs to catch up in AI. And if you think back to the beginning of this year, there was an AI summit in Paris at the beginning of February, and President Macron and then Ursula von der Leyen promised that there would be 200 billion of euros invested, mixed public and private money into AI to get Europe ahead. Europe was going to build AI gigafactories across the continent, and there are frenzied attempts right now to somehow enlist private capital, venture funds, but also, say, companies like Deutsche Telekom, to get these funds together and somehow get Europe ahead, get Europe to the cause of AI. So the bottom line, the Brussels consensus on AI is that we need to join public and private forces, meaning big money, in order to give Europe the push ahead into the AI future, because otherwise we fall off a cliff. That's the consensus. Now, the question for us, of course, is what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that narrative? And it turns out there are a few things that are wrong with that. And I want to basically cut this in two parts. I want to first tell you why I think that the diagnosis is fundamentally wrong, that if we don't keep up in the AI race, then that Europe is lost, and then what the damage is that's done by actually believing in that narrative and pushing ahead with these kinds of innovations. And you'll see that there are quite a few points of connection with the things that you've heard from Roanne. I was really, in an extremely positive way, surprised to see like all the points of connections that we have here. Now, overhyped AI first. I think it's important to add this one little disclaimer that yes, it is true that you can really do quite amazing things with AI. It's not that this is an all bad story. AI can do great things when it comes, for example, to medical diagnostics. There are things that work really well. It can do weather prediction. It can help us use resources more efficiently and, for example, say, cut waste in certain kinds of industries. It can aid scientific discovery. It can help with automated navigation, these sorts of things. They're really true. So there is something that we could think of as good AI innovation, and I think that does deserve our support. Having said that, I think AI is much too broad a category to speak about in these general terms. So most people, when they say AI these days, what they really think of is something like ChatGPT or other forms of generative AI. And there it turns out that quite a few people feel that the actual economic advantages, really in terms of boosting GDP, boosting productivity, are relatively limited. Because a lot of what ends up happening is that you can use these tools to, say, for example, automate certain processes in insurance companies, for example, or in banks, or these sorts of things. But it's not a fundamental transformation. It is quite often a cost-cutting exercise, and it doesn't really do anything to boost demand out there. It just shifts money that was previously spent on wages to either the tech companies that have sold the tech or the people who own the company. But it doesn't really boost the economy as a whole. What's more interesting for us is maybe different kinds of applications. So, for example, AI in robotics, something that is now really starting to take off. And what's important there is if you think of using AI in robotics, then you don't need these huge data centers that cost hundreds of billions of dollars to put together around the world. But these are relatively localized systems in a company where you have custom-tailored software systems that learn on the job, say, for example, how to manipulate certain pretty finicky items or something like that. So if you think of where are the economic benefits of AI, don't think ChatGPT so much, but think of very different kinds of AI, and it doesn't take AI gigafactories to actually see these things materialize. Even there, though, we have the question, what is the aggregate effect on our economy? Because yet again, on the one hand, these efficiency gains that we do get, they could be redistributed to the workers who could then actually use the money to maybe buy different things with that, and we would get overall economic growth. But if that doesn't happen, and there are few indications that it does happen, because often AI is actually used to put workers in more intense competition with each other, then the only thing that happens is that the money that is being saved ends up in the pockets of the few, and you don't get bigger economic growth, but just higher inequality. Now, more importantly then, you find that a whole lot of AI actually isn't used for societal benefit at all, and that's where the plot starts to thicken here. So I think it's important that we distinguish between good innovation, useless innovation, and harmless innovation. And that's important because whenever you say innovation in Brussels, or in The Hague for that matter, you always get a 2 thumbs up kind of direction. Innovation is unambiguously great, but I think quite often it's actually bad. So if we look at who actually spends most money on AI, who are the really big AI spenders, then we have to think of companies like Meta, like Google, AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft. Let's start with the first two. Google and Meta are advertising companies. They're not search engine companies, they're not social media networks, they're advertising companies that use a social media platform to sell advertising. Google does the same with the search engine. The search engine is a vehicle to sell advertising. That's the business model. So if they spend additional money on AI systems to optimize their systems, what they're doing is they're perfecting their ad tech, which is what a search engine and a social media platform is. So their business is to help customers sell stuff that people otherwise wouldn't buy. And they are the ones who invest billions of dollars to get even better at that with AI. What that means is that if we in Europe don't spend these billions of dollars for companies that develop even better tools to deceive and manipulate people, it's not at all clear to me that that's actually a bad thing. If we don't have our own Google spending this kind of money, I would say 2 thumbs up to that. That, for me, falls into the category of bad innovation, because the whole point is to get people to buy stuff that they otherwise wouldn't. Now, think of something like Amazon, then. How does Amazon use AI? For example, it uses to optimize its own pricing strategy so that it can squeeze the third-party sellers on the Amazon platform that have no other way of gaining access to customers, because these Amazon platform or other platforms like it have become the bottlenecks to access to potential buyers. And so Amazon can fine-tune its prices so that it can maximize its own profits. Or otherwise, it uses AI to streamline processes in its own logistics center so that it can squeeze its own workers more. Again, if we don't have companies that in an equivalent kind of way here in Europe spend that kind of money on AI, I think from a societal perspective, that's actually good news, because what we see is that few people benefit and many pay the price. I think one key lesson here is that we have to understand that AI is a powerful tool that the powerful use to enhance their own power. It's not a neutral technology that have us out there, but in the real world, it's being used by those who have power already to augment their power, whether it's financial, political, whatever, cultural. And so if we're already worried about power asymmetries in society, then we should definitely be wary of AI, because in the real world, it helps those that are powerful that are already. It also means we shouldn't compare ourselves all the time to the United States and China, because there we see on many levels that a lot of the money that is being spent on AI actually doesn't benefit the average citizen, but just the very few. Now, in the meantime, let's for a moment also consider the actual damage that is done by these things. Now, a lot of the things that Roanne talked about statistics before that show up in economic statistics as economic growth actually turn out not to be really good for society at all. Right? So if Instagram coaxes more people to buy more fast fashion and throw that away faster, that does count as economic growth. But I hope that many of us would agree that from a broader perspective, that's actually bad news. It's bad news for the planet. It's bad news for the people who have to produce this fast fashion. It's bad news for the wallets of the people who keep spending on all this stuff, right? So that's growth, but it's bad growth. Or think of the enormous environmental destruction that AI already causes. Electricity consumption is going through the roof. In many places, we find that climate goals are being missed because of the investment in AI gigafactories, all the resources that AI absorbs. Just a few days ago, when Donald Trump was in Saudi Arabia, again, there was a deal with the Saudi prince where 600 billion investment, and not all of it in AI, but a lot of it in AI, was agreed between the United States and Saudi Arabia, again, to build humongous AI data factories in the Saudi desert and also facilities in the United States, where you can ask yourself not only what does this do to energy usage, but also the real environmental damage of extracting all the minerals that are needed to put together these computer chips. That is real damage that these things do without any obvious benefit to the wider economy at large. Which is to say that there is good growth, but there's also very bad growth. And without that distinction, these kinds of graphs that I showed you before that say plus 8%, plus $1.2 trillion is something that may on paper in the spreadsheet be true, but there is no guarantee at all that these are genuine benefits without downsides or that these are widely shared in society. Not at all. And then there are things that really have an impact and are part and parcel of how AI affects our working lives, but that never show up in the statistics. And these are the sorts of things that I think you already started talking about. So Roanne gave us quite a few examples from the world of healthcare. And I want to give a few other examples that for some of us may be closer to home, how digital systems frequently create extra work in the background and that never really shows up as an actual cost. So if we think of our own work here in the academic world of how digital technologies that have entered our lives always create extra work for us and these mini tasks that are super irritating for us but somehow never really get recognized. So this is like fiddling with self-bediening and the reimbursement forms, for example. These are things like, all the hassle that we have all the time with video conferencing software that doesn't work, authentication systems where you've got to log in all the time constantly in these different things, struggles that we may have with digital learning platforms. We have to switch them back between different things, uploading our recorded lectures here, there, and everywhere. And then, of course, most of all, the impact that AI has on our teaching, has on our assessment systems, and how for us and the people who examine students, this creates an enormous extra amount of work for us, and we still haven't even started to figure out how to do proper assessment in the time of AI. So what you get are these technologies that are presented as helpers, and in our daily working lives, we struggle all the time, 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, but that really accumulates. That's a genuine cost that these technologies have, but in the super sleek presentation that the salesperson gave to the UvA CVB, that of course was never mentioned at all. Then it was just like, this perfect solution to everything. Now, why does it happen? Because it doesn't really consider the social context in which these technologies are actually being used. And again, I think there's a parallel what you were talking about. So, what this overall means is that the economists who sell this hype narrative to policymakers, that policymakers also buy into, come with a very narrow understanding, a very economistic understanding of how productivity and how economic dynamics work. And there's one final thing that I wanted to show you, and again, I think that really ties perfectly to what you were saying. It's this book right here by a sociologist, Alison Pugh. It's called The Last Human Job: The Work of Connecting in a Disconnected World. And I'll give you that already, because this is it's not a present, but something that I think, because then you have otherwise forget it. Because this is so connected to what I think you were talking about, Roanne. Alison Pugh in this book talks about how AI is being introduced in many fields that count as connective labor. That could be nursing in the medical world, teachers in schools, police people who work in the street just connecting with neighborhoods, but also psychotherapists, for example, judges, and how in all of these professions, the genuine human connection that you have is essential to the work, is essential to not only the fulfillment that people experience, but also to getting the job done. For example, convincing somebody to change their behavior, but also encouraging a student in elementary school, telling them that maybe, yes, they got a bad grade, but that somebody believed in them and encouraging them to somehow struggle through it and get better and finally get it done. That is something that no YouTube tutorial can replace. If you think of the work of a teacher only as transmitting knowledge as to what is the formula to maybe add integers together, yes, that is something that you can let a YouTube video do. Getting students to finally perform, giving them the courage, giving them the hope and the trust in themselves is a completely different story. And that's true across so many different professions, in all of which AI is being introduced. Why? Because to people introduce it, narrow down the task that is being performed to something that is purely a kind of cognitive transaction. Take out the human component, and you think that AI would be great and a cost-effective way of doing this. Consider what really the work entails. Ask the people who actually do the work, and you get a completely different picture. What that means is there is a constant erosion of the quality of service provision, whether it's at hotel reception, as I said, in schools and police, wherever you go. And we experience that on a daily basis in our interactions with digitized systems that we find less meaningful, frustrating, off, all these sorts of things. But the people who sell these things in the statistics, these dynamics never show up. So there is a creeping shrinkage, impoverishment of the kinds of work that is actually being performed, of the services that are being offered, but it doesn't show up. So, what is to be done? The final thing that I briefly want to talk about. As Justus said, I spend a fair bit of time in Brussels, talking to policymakers, members of the European Parliament, lobbyists, all sorts of people. And as I said, you can still feel that there is this genuine vibe that somehow missing the AI train would be fatal for Europe. At the same time, there's also a different dynamic that has now kicked in and gathered speed. And that's the one thing that gives me slight hope, at least. Certainly since the moment that Donald Trump moved back into the Oval Office, there is a sense that our dependence on American tech is a genuine source of vulnerability for Europe. So there is a big push in favor of somehow creating something that you could think of digital sovereignty, AI sovereignty, somehow getting our dependencies on US tech out of our systems. And that means also pushing for European alternatives somewhere. So at least on some level, there is a sense that maybe we could push a reset button on some of the digital environments within which we work. And that might be the only chance that we have to reorient in a much more fundamental way how we have these digital technologies in our lives and how something like AI will or will not become part of our lives. For us, that will have to mean, more than anything else, that these technologies will have to be less profit-driven, because I think that's the one crux that we see right now. They're diffused, Rana, I think you mentioned that they're diffused by companies that want to make a buck, or maybe in the future a euro with all of this, which is understandable, but which leads to a kind of digitization that is not necessarily, and often quite contrary, to the interests of ordinary citizens like us right here. And finally, as I said, I think the good news is that if we compare ourselves to the United States and China, yes, it is indeed the case that we're lagging seriously behind in terms of the money that we spend, in terms of the number of patents and the size of the companies. But as far as I'm concerned, 80% of the stuff that's happening with AI is either useless or outright harmful. If we use the resources that we have for the 20% that are actually worthwhile, then the money available, the talent that we have available, will, I think, actually get us quite the way without a lot of the damage that's done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very insightful. Can we talk about Brussels again?
Sure. Let's talk about Brussels.
I was thinking about the decision makers, and perhaps I have that meme, that little video clip too clear in mind, where you see, do you remember the court case with Mark Zuckerberg, where the decision makers obviously do not understand what Facebook is all about, or Meta is all about? I always want to think that the decision makers in Brussels are not that naive, but do they really understand the types of AI that they have to make decisions about?
It's a challenge, right? I mean, if you, so my impression is that there are gradients. That your average member of the European Parliament who has like 5 dossiers and has a training in some field, whatever, I'm amazed at how well they still do understand what's going on. I mean, I also don't want to know how many hours per day they must be working to do what they do. I mean, like, that's got to be, so I have deep respect for that. Doesn't change the fact that, of course, compared to the people who really develop these kinds of technologies or who spend their whole days researching them, they're at a serious disadvantage, right? And it's not only that, what makes it worse, so like I think that is a real political problem that we face here, is these technologies, they develop at such a speed that even when, I mean, Justus, right, you said as much, you know, a few years back, what would count as the received wisdom about what you can or cannot do with certain systems can be completely outdated 2 years later. So there is the gap between what one would ideally want to know to be able to make informed decisions about these things and what's really happening out and what people do really know, that's getting bigger. And I think that's a handicap when it comes to taking back public control over these technologies that's really hard to overcome.
Yeah. I was sensing in between the lines, but you weren't super explicit about it, so I want to make sure that I got this right, that there's, of course, there's this sense of competition, right? We have to do or else. But is there also a similar hope that the managers of my hospitals have, namely with AI, at least with AI, we can solve this and this problem? Is there a hope with the decision makers you get to speak to?
So my impression is, I don't know what you hear from your people, is that this is something that has shifted over the years. So again, like Justus's 2017 book, I think that was still at an age where a lot of the writing was still about, on the hope side, it was, a very big picture, like humanity with AI, we could solve these things, would have more free time, you could become more creative, you would have very utopian kinds of things. And then the problems that people have were like very general ethical debates about privacy, bias, and these sorts of things. And what I sense, what has happened during the past 1 to 2 years, is that as big money has really moved into this field, that the whole conversation has shifted much more to the economic side of things. That whereas previously you would have philosophers of technology running around in Brussels telling people about AI, these sorts of things, now it's consultants, right? And humanity in the age of AI is like, no, like what does this do to our employment figures? What is the bottom line GDP? Do you hear stories that these broad musings have been replaced by like a much more bread and butter, okay, can we save money with this sort of thing? Like, are these big picture visions, are they still part of what your people, the people you talk about, what they dream about?
I think a lot of the time they're just being overwhelmed with the offerings, right? So they have so much to choose from. You should really see it like that. So what I see very often, for example, is that companies, or in collaboration with hospitals, come with new AI tools that they think is a really good problem solver, but the actual people on the floor say, well, we didn't really have that problem, right? So that's kind of my image of the pizza, or of an outdoor sports shop. You know those where you come in and you're like, oh, I didn't know I needed a sleeping bag with a straw in it. And then you walk out with a sleeping bag with a straw in it, right? It's like that. So just to give a very concrete example, one of the major AI tools now being used is something where you can diagnose yourself a mole to see whether it's cancer or not. And this thing is very handy for a lot of people. It also gives a lot of false positives, right? So it wants to be on the safe side, or the coders want it to be on the safe side. So what you see now is that a lot of extra moles are being taken out. Because the younger doctors don't have the self-confidence to not trust in it. Now, interestingly, this tool was sold as something that would really help general practitioners, because they said, they're generalists, they don't really have the expertise that is needed. If you talk to general practitioners, they say, well, that was really a quite simple task. That took me 2 minutes, because I can just make a photo, send it to someone if I don't trust it, but most of the time, that was the least of my concerns. So you see a kind of top-down way of inventing things that seems sometimes really interesting for the people who do not work with it. And so if you ask me about the grander visions, I don't really see that at all. I just see an over-asking almost of what do we need, rather than do we need it at all?
Yeah, and it seems, at some point, I love the things that you said about how supply-driven this is, that you get like these companies that keep knocking on hospital doors and say, oh, we got this, oh, we got this, oh, we got this, that at some point they actually say, no, we don't want... And
now they've closed the hospital corridors, but they've moved on to insurance companies, which are, of course, very, very interested in especially preventive and diagnosing things, Yeah,
and you can, of course, totally see the kinds of dynamic that then the insurance companies would say to the hospital, we're only sending you our patients if you use technologies X, Y, and Z, because otherwise you fall under too expensive for us, even though no euro has been saved yet, already.
Yeah.
That's pretty... So one thing that you mentioned that, so you and I seem to be sort of like on the same side, that there's many more downsides than maybe some policymakers and other decision makers realize. But you also said that there wasn't a whole lot of resistance, or certainly there wasn't a whole lot of coordinated resistance. No. People work around it, and maybe sometimes people ignore what the system tells them. Can you say a little bit more about did people ever say, well, maybe we should all band together and just throw some of this stuff out or something? Or was it how micro versus potentially collective was the pushback against some of this?
I've not seen, I do roundtables sometimes where that kind of vibe arises, but I think it has to do there with the fact that people speak with people in other hospitals, so it's not as politicized. It's more of a recognition, like, oh, do you worry about this as well? In the theater play, there's a doctor at the stage who is held responsible for something that her AI is doing, and she speaks to the audience. And there oftentimes it's professionals, it's professional caretakers in the audience. And there sometimes people start crying, or they will leave the audience hall, or they will, there's something like that arises. But I find in the daily busyness, it often kind of ends in nothingness. Again, these people, if we show them the reports from our interviews, they're often very surprised to see that other people also do these coping strategies. Yeah. But for them, it's like, as you said, all those micro tasks come at your desk, right? And so for these people, it's like, oh, it's actually saving me a bit of time, but I also have to double check it. Or I also have to fill in that form. Or I also have to work with the positive or the negative feedback loop. Or there is something called AI fatigue, right? When the alarm just keeps going, which also happens where doctors have just learned to ignore it. And one of the very interesting and also very painful case studies, this was in a Scandinavian hospital where it was a very cool AI because the doctors had helped develop it and they were very proud because it really worked for them, etc. And we asked them about, so what do you do with the extra time that you then win? And all of them, without exception, would say things like, I will talk more to my patients. I will ask them how their holidays was. Yeah. I will ask them how their kid is, because this is so important. And then in reality, when we shadow work them, what we saw is that all of them, without exception, spent their time on training a second algorithm that they now want to take into use. And the reason is they're so enthusiastic, but also the management is really incentivizing this because they want to sell the algorithm after it works well enough to other hospitals for use. Yeah. So you see this fantasy about and it's a bit the same as with time management, right? Time management teaches you to do things quicker, after which you can answer even more emails quicker. It's not that a lot of us take the time to think, okay, I've been so quick with my email, let me go outwards with this book and read for half of the afternoon, right?
No, that's fantasy. The opposite happens, right? Like we read less and less. And this, I mean, maybe it's an age thing, I don't know, but
it probably is.
It probably is, yeah. That bright future never arrives.
No. Oh, you mean the future in which you have time to finally read the book? And yeah. No.
On any level. Yeah. I mean, again, this sounds like, post-midlife crisis kind of stuff. But But I think it's true for tech, but it's true in so many other ways, that we're constantly being told, oh yeah, so this is going to be a little bit unpleasant in whatever economic restructuring, pension cuts, whatever we're in. On the one hand, everything's supposed to be getting better, well, certainly because we have all these amazing technologies, and then yet tomorrow we'll actually reap the benefits of them all. Just right now, it's still, there's still a little bit unwieldy to work with, and actually, yeah, they're going to stress you out a little bit, but tomorrow we have an email system that actually starts saving you time. That never happens. That we never get to that point. I feel that even I've been around long enough to, and that seems to be sort of like a systematic thing, which is why I think, Justus, you mentioned that before, but why a social scientific perspective that also really takes into account both the political economy dynamics, but also the work realities and the organization realities in which people find themselves, in which these technologies are actually applied because of the dynamics that prevail in there, right? So I think what you just said about the hospitals wanting to gather this data, train another algorithm that they can now sell, is of course part and parcel of still sort of an data extractive, commercial logic that's at play here, where different entities compete with each other. If your hospital doesn't do it, mine does it, this sort of thing, and the same is true for us. We feel if we all have AI superpowers at our disposal, we, can write more text, write more blogs, write more articles, correct more student papers, what have you not, somehow. And that's, as long as this competitive element doesn't disappear, it's not generating time saving. It's just like more of this. And it doesn't matter what the technologies that you throw at us, that's not going to go away. Like it's not. So it was almost 100 years ago that John Maynard Keynes wrote this essay, like the economic possibilities of our grandchildren, right? And you know, where he was like, wow, it's going to be so cool. You know, like with all the tech that's coming up, like folks going to be working 4 hours a day, and the rest, you know, they're going to be chillaxing effectively, right? Because, you know, like...
He did not say the word chillaxing.
No, he didn't say chillaxing, but like he had like a very bucolic sort of... That hasn't happened. Like any study, I mean, people are more stressed out than ever. And by now, I think sort of like digital tech, I think is an integral part of that in our private lives, but also in our working lives.
Yeah. I am thinking, if you look at some of the positive examples that I sometimes also see, they can teach us about what might be the requirements then for a more positive example, right? So one of the case studies that I do find interesting is one in which, first of all, the doctor in case developed it herself. She's very tech savvy, so she was kind of like, oh, I want to think about a problem that I see on my work floor and think about how I can automate or support the nurses in this case. And what she has done is she built a very simple algorithm that is basically helping the nurses make a decision, but she trains them differently. She says, you make the decision based on your expertise, your gut feel, and then you double check with an algorithm. If it says something completely different, you ask a colleague, which is, I think, a very wise way of working, but also a different way of working that we see otherwise. And what I really like about that kind of empirical evidence about, oh, sometimes this is why it actually works and why it is actually contributing to making less mistakes and saving more time, it just shows the prerequisite. So apparently, having a person who is the expert on her field making something or co-making something might be a better step in the right direction than having Microsoft make something for you, or even making a hospital making something for a GP, right?
Yeah. There was one thing that I really picked up that I do want to quickly talk with you about, because of that it was super, super interesting, this intuition point that you made.
Yeah.
Because like that's something, you know, when we talked before, you know, you briefly said that you've been teaching yoga, you know, I do a lot of yoga. Where meditation, sorry. You know, but where, you know, where sort of like embodiment and all, you know, all this sort of stuff is like super important. So this is something that also on that level, like immediately resonated with me. And I wondered, you know, so I just want to invite you to say more about that, but I wondered there whether we haven't even started to understand really how this intuition actually works, because we've for so long taken it for granted that it's like operates as a background, not even skill. You know, skill already sounds like something, oh, I can do calculation in my head or something, but like a background quality, competence feature or something that we have. And it's only as we try to, you know, squeeze our working processes in these disembodied technologies, do we even start to realize that there always was this thing that was operating in the background that never really, you know, got a big name, never got a lot of recognition or something. You only start as noticing it when you try to shift these working patterns to something where that's no longer there, digital tech. And as one of the things that you said was that that privately people will talk about how that's important and how they reach decisions, but then put them on a stage and they come up with other stuff.
Evidence-based is the trend word. Yeah, I mean, we also humans make mistakes, right? And young doctors, for example, really have to learn and add up to their bodily experience. So you see oftentimes that the really expert nurses are also the ones having more of this experience. My concern lies mostly with how do you develop intuition if you don't have the practice of making first your own decision on a gut feel? And you'll see in older trainings that there's a lot of attention for that. Like
apprenticeship style, this sort of thing.
Yes, and you see also in the new curriculum that there's very little time for that, if at all, because people now also have to learn and code in their first years of hospital, or learn how to work with intuition.
So thank you so much for the lectures. Thank you so much for your conversation. that conversation will not continue here right now, but we do invite you to have drinks and to continue the conversation there. And I'm sure that we will hear much more about this topic and from your work later. So please join me in thanking the speakers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
all.